Good evening, everyone. This is the Education Committee meeting. It is March 11th, and we're in the Cardinal Room. Welcome, everyone. Are there any announcements? No announcements. There are minutes. If anyone has any corrections, give them to Brooke. So, tonight, what order do we want to do these in? We want to do the gifted first. So we have two presentations, and the first one we are going to do is the elementary gifted screening.
Good evening. This is less of a presentation and more of just a discussion. However, I did put a slide together. As Dr. Miner and I have been talking about gifted education and what gifted education looks like in Upper Dublin, a couple things stood out to us. One of those things was that we have many children who, when assessed for gifted education, don't necessarily qualify, but they're in need of enrichment. And so we're looking administratively at putting gifted with some other administrators for next year so that we can look at gifted and enrichment services in a strong way so that it actually becomes a focus of someone's job on behalf of our kids. The second thing that we're going to recommend is to do our gifted screening differently, using a different assessment than what we're using right now. So right now we use an assessment called the COGAT. It's group administered, and it aims to identify what students' learned reasoning and problem-solving abilities are. There is a verbal component, there's a quantitative component, and there's nonverbal test items. And there's a newer version that was designed to be appropriate for non-native English speakers. And right now, we give that assessment to our first graders in the spring. There's nothing wrong with the COGAT. The COGAT is nationally recognized as an assessment, as a universal screener for gifted education. But in thinking about our work here in the district, I'm going to be recommending that we move away from the COGAT and we use an assessment called the INNAT. It's the Naglieri Nonverbal Assessment. This test, just like the COGAT, is group administered, but it primarily focuses on nonverbal reasoning and general problem-solving skills. Why is that important? The nonverbal component of it takes away cultural bias. It removes that as a barrier. This places an emphasis on abstract shapes and designs. So there's unbiased scoring, regardless of a child's primary language, education, or socioeconomic background. One of the things that has always been a challenge in school districts is that students that don't have a ton of background knowledge about topics sometimes get missed when we do elementary screening for gifted ed. And so as an attempt to work around that, the COGAT is a good assessment, and it's been used widely. Many districts are moving toward the INNAT, and I would like to move Upper Dublin towards the INNAT. One of the benefits of using the INNAT, it's group administered, it takes about 45 minutes, it's digitized and online, so we get the results immediately. So thinking about our second grade classes, second grade teacher takes her students or his students to the computer lab where we bring in the Chromebooks. It's nonverbal, so it's heavily picture-oriented, it's graphical. When the entire class is done testing in that 45-minute period, we get the student scores. So not only are we moving cultural bias and removing some of the language, we're also getting results in a more timely manner. We give the COGAT in the spring of first grade. I recommend that we look at the NNAT at the beginning of second grade, sometime in the September-October timeframe. IQ is generally firmed up around chronological age 8, And so looking at the fall time frame for second grade would be the optimal time for the INNAT. Having used the INNAT in previous settings, I can tell you that almost without exception, the scores that we're able to get, the IQ scores that we were able to glean from the INNAT, were plus or minus one of the scores that our school psychologists were able to get. So the assessment is valid, it's reliable, and I think what it will do, because we do have an uptick of students that their first language isn't English, and we know that we have a growing population of economically disadvantaged students that are in that subgroup. It could potentially allow us to cast the net wide enough to catch those students so that we're not missing students who could potentially be tested for gifted support just because they either have a language barrier or they don't have enough background knowledge in a subject area. Also, kids that have speech problems, receptive and expressive language, the NNAT takes that out of the equation. And one of the things that I can tell you, having seen the NNAT used not only in districts that I've worked in, but in other districts, what it does, it allows you also to target those kids that don't necessarily need gifted instruction, but that are really in need of enrichment, and identifies that cohort of kids better. And we know that's a cohort of kids that we struggle with. And so looking at this, there is not a tremendous cost differential. The NNAT is a little bit cheaper per student. It's not a significant move. But the reason I wanted to bring this tonight is we are approaching the spring, and I would like to be able to communicate to our elementary families that they won't see the COGAT in the spring this year, but they will see the NNAT in the fall, and we will communicate what that all entails. So with that, I'll gladly open it to board questions.
So you always answer my questions. Because I was going to ask a little bit about whether it correlated or was validated against other verbal-based IQ tests, because I wondered if, although I think it's positive to be culturally neutral, I mean, my question really was whether it ended up being biased against those kids that are high verbal and not as good on, say, spatial reasoning.
It is not, and I can send and put some studies up on the website where the NNAT still picked up the kids that the COGAT picked up, but it also picked up those kids that had some verbal issues or some issues where English wasn't their first language. So I'm not so concerned about that. Keeping in mind that this is also one data point. So if we get an NNAT score on a student and we decide, you know what, we're not sure that assessment, just like we do with a COGAT, you know, we're not sure that's representative of how the student is performing, you know, it's a starting point for conversation.
No, that sounds good. Thank you. Questions or comments?
Thanks for presenting this. Couple questions. The first one is this going to be the only test or the only point that kids get identified, or are there other opportunities throughout their careers?
There are other opportunities for students to be identified. Given that IQ does start to solidify around chronological age 8, it does make sense for us to have a universal screener in this grade level. The NNAT can be used at multiple grade levels. And so one of the things that I think would behoove the district is initially look at second grade, and then do we want to look at another elementary grade, perhaps maybe fourth grade or fifth grade, to look to see are there kids that we should be looking at further for gifted education?
And is there also room for teacher input or parent input or anything like that?
There definitely is. So the NNAT, just like the COGAT, is one data point. So in the state of Pennsylvania, we look at a full scale IQ of 130 and additional factors requiring gifted services. So there's teacher input, there is parent input, and one of the things I'd like to look at, even though we're talking about second graders, is some sort of limited student input into their their learning. Because if you ever ask an elementary kid how they think they learn, you get some of the most honest, raw answers ever. And so I think it does behoove us to actually engage kids in that. They wouldn't know necessarily that it's for gifted, but asking a child how he or she learns, I think provides some good qualitative data for evaluation.
One final question. When I was reading up on this a little bit, I saw a number of districts are using the NNAT first and then follow up with the COGAT. Is that something that you're considering or recommending?
Many districts that follow up with the COGAT was developed with the ITBS test, the Iowa Test of Basic Skills in mind. I think given the assessment culture that we're in with having PSSAs, I don't feel the need for the COGAT as a checks and balance. If, for example, we see that the NNAT is not doing what we needed to do for us in the first year, we could look at the COGAT. My hunch, having implemented this in other places, I don't think we're going to need to do the COGAT as the checks and balance. I think especially, honestly, we need to do a better job of looking at enrichment for kids that are not in gifted education. All of the research out there that says if you put non-gifted students in gifted settings, you actually weaken the instruction for the gifted students. Many districts do that because they don't have an alternative other than you get what everyone's getting or you get gifted. We have to look, because we do have a fairly unique population, that we have several cohorts of kids that don't need enrichment in every single lesson every single day, but they need periodic enrichment to take different skills and concepts deeper. And as we look at the elementary supervisor of education next year, and we also look at Kim Schuler and her redefined position, gifted education is going to be germane to both of those positions.
So, do you want to preview that you're going to talk about gifted education at an upcoming meeting?
Yes. So, were there any other questions about the NNAP before I
have a comment?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think just given all the work that we're doing around equity, this motion or this idea or proposal just seems to fit with a lot of the things that we're really trying to do for all of our students to make sure that whether it be a cultural bias or any other barriers, to make sure that they have access to the gifted program.
I just want to make sure I clarify things just based on the other questions. I want to make sure I understand correctly. We're talking about really replacing the COGAT screener at the end of first grade with the NNAT screener at the beginning of second grade just as the screener. And this isn't necessarily affecting our GMDE process or any other child find thing. This is just that, right? And we would continue to do the GMDE process exactly the way we do it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. That is not affected by this.
So the only real question I have is around timing. Right now, we screen at the end of first grade. We get the results back right at the end of, or even during the summer. And we begin the process of metering out those evaluations starting at the beginning of second grade. And because there's sometimes a lot of them, it takes a long time, and kids aren't in until months and months later. And I'm wondering if this is an opportunity to revisit the timing, because starting that in the middle of the year sometimes is awkward. You have kids joining when other kids have already been there, and at least as long as we continue with the same pull-out design that we have. So it just seems like an opportunity to think about the timing. I understand that the results timing of the two tests is very different, and so maybe this ends up with exactly what we have in terms of timing, but it just seems like maybe something that can be addressed.
I think, one of the things that we have to look at, I think sometimes school districts, not just Upper Dublin, but we make kids gifted because we don't have another alternative. And so we say that there are extenuating factors that move them into the gifted range. I think one of the things that we need to do a better job of on the enrichment side is really give kids enrichment all the all through. So kids that need enrichment in kindergarten, kids that need enrichment in first grade. I think having seen this employed in multiple districts and at that timing, we did not really see a lag in the number of kids having to wait an exponentially longer time to get evaluated. What we actually saw were some kids that under other assessments wouldn't necessarily, that would have been assessed before, are not being assessed now. And that's why I say, after we get this up and running in second grade, I would like to explore in the future a second chance in elementary to look at this before kids matriculate to the middle school.
Right, okay, so all those other things that I said in terms of child find and all that, that's a separate conversation that we
Separate
need to
conversation.
have,
All of those things will still, we're still mandated to do child find. We're still mandated to do the full evaluation process. We're just talking about the screener here.
Okay, thanks.
Dr. Ludwig asked me to, Dr. Ludwig asked me to talk about or preview the work that we're going to do around gifted education. I think about 2 years ago, there was a gifted review committee. I think with the different push that's coming from PDE around equity, I really want to revive that, and I want to look at how we're writing GIEPs. I think districts in general are missing the I in GIEP, that we are not really individualizing the instruction and the experience for kids. Districts do a really good job of that when students have an IEP because they have a learning disability, getting very targeted instruction, very targeted experiences. Somewhere along the lines, because PDE, gifted is not monitored, it is not, there's no teeth to it. The I in GIEP has gone away. And so I think there was a study maybe 4 or 5 years ago that in over 400 school districts, GIEP were very cookie cutter. And what we need to do is flip that, and we need to say, based upon students' evaluations, what special instruction, not just extra instruction, but what instruction do kids need in place of what their regular education peers are getting? Again, when we look at PVAS and we look at how we're moving kids in terms of standardized tests, we always get high achievement from these kids. What we don't always get is growth, and that's because we're not individualizing. And quite honestly, we're making school boring for these kids. We need to bolster that so that these kids are getting what they need, that we're feeding their intellectual curiosity to make sure that they're getting their full potential out of the education we provide.
Dr. Yanni, in your opinion, do you think EdNat would identify more students that require enrichment or disqualify more students?
I think what it'll do, I think it'll pick up those kids that might be missed under other measures, kids that maybe English isn't their first language, or they don't have the level of background knowledge that kids have in topics. It removes some of those extraneous factors. And so I think we'll be looking at a sub cohort of kids moving forward that would not have and historically have not been picked up by other assessments. And so one of the things that we would do as part of this process, we know how many gifted evaluations there are year over year, and we'll be looking and doing a data comparison to say, are we seeing about the same number of kids coming up through the screener as possibly needing a gifted evaluation, or do we see more or less? And we'll have conversations around that. In my experience, we've always seen a few more with the NNAT over the COGAT or other measures that we used.
Real quick, sorry, Amy. I'm sure there are lots of districts have made this switch, and the threshold that you pick for the NNAT, just like there's a threshold that you pick for the COGAT, is your own choice. It's a relatively arbitrary choice because it's a screener. So, are there good comparisons you can show us about, to answer Stan's question about, how many and who gets picked at what threshold levels? I mean, there must be out there.
There are. So I could absolutely pull districts that move to NNAT in our comparison group, districts like Upper Dublin. One of the things that I think we always have to be careful about when we look at the districts that we've been comparing ourselves to, this year we're looking at Radnor, Wallingford, Swarthmore, and a couple other what I would call big league school districts. We do have a few more students in each of our subgroups than they have, so I can pull that comparative data to look and see if we have. I can get you that. I can absolutely get you that.
I can reframe the question for you. I think the question was something like, what do you mean by subgroups?
Sure.
And the
So
size?
we have a few more percentage points of students in the economically disadvantaged subgroup, in some race and ethnicity subgroups, as well as our English language learner subgroups. Which, quite honestly, when you look at gifted education, English language learners and African American students are historically underrepresented in gifted education. That's why I think we have to look at doing things differently, because we have to give every kid a chance to at least have the opportunity to be looked at for gifted. I know in a previous district I worked in, students that had very little English acquisition came up very high on the NNAT, and we were able to accelerate instruction through ESL, and they were actually part of the gifted program and are performing really, really well. And so this is all about giving kids the opportunity and taking away barriers that have kept kids out of certain groups in the past.
I think one of the things that I appreciate about this movement that you're trying to make, a couple of years ago, the EAC, we did a report around the topic of essentially the excellence gap and that growth piece for the students who are identified as gifted. And I realize you have a lot of reading to do, but if you haven't seen that report, it's really good. The one question I had, one of the challenges with these group screeners is for some of our students with attentional issues. Did the NNAT report any, improvement over the COGAT in terms of kids not getting dinged for processing speed, things that they can get dinged for?
Yeah, so the NNAT looks a little more friendlier to students than the COGAT and some other assessments. So kids are naturally more attentive. One of the things that we did in one of the districts that I worked, we chose not to assess an entire class at one time, but we would run about a half a class through a computer lab. We actually put Chromebooks in a room, and we ran a half a class and a half a class and a half a class and a half a class. And what that did, that took away all that extraneous noise and filler in the room. I can't say that was any more or less effective than anything else, because sometimes when you assess students in a setting that they've never been in before, it has negative impact on the testing. But one of the things that I could say was that having used the NNAT, I've actually had conversations with teachers in other districts that said, I wouldn't have picked up that this student has the ability to perform in such a high way. And it changes the expectations for kids from teachers to students. And it's also a great tool to be able to speak to with parents. So, you have the ability to do great things, but you're not performing that well in class, or you're not performing that well for your teacher. So it also creates a basis of discussion for, hey, we know what you're capable of, so now we have to make sure that you're working to that potential.
That's very helpful. Do you think that at some point, I know one of the concerns that parents have had has been around transparency, understanding this process. The fact that we're doing this presentation is great. Do you anticipate training the parents and teachers around what this is so that they're not just getting it in the mail, kind of like we do now?
Sure. So what I have is a letter that I'll share with the board in our weekly update this week that will go out at the end of March. That does a side-by-side comparison of the COGAT and the NNAT, drawing the conclusion of why we're recommending the NNAT over the COGAT. One of the things that I think most districts forget about, we do standardized assessment and we send it out to parents, and they get a scoring key or they get a profile report, and it's explained either number one, not at all, or only in the language that comes from the assessment manufacturer, from the assessment protocols. So what I developed in the past was a parent-friendly version of understanding what your kids' scores mean on assessments like the COGAT and on the NNAT. So it's much like us explaining it in person rather than getting this very clinical piece of paper that says, if your child's score is in this score band, it means X, Y, or Z. It explains to parents in non-educational jargon what the scores actually mean.
One other question. Will there be a process of figuring out what the cutoff we're going to use? Is there some adjustment, or is it fairly standard, and do other districts really kind of all fall in the same standard?
Most districts fall in the same standard. We will actually have a representative come out and look at our historical data, and we will work collaboratively to set that standard.
So at this point, you're going to, why don't you go ahead?
Just to two of the points you just made, you had said that one of the benefits of going through the screener is that we get information about the student. We can say, you're not, well, the COGAT provides 3 separate scores, or actually, sort of 9 separate scores if you want to really dive down. And the NNAT, as I understand it, only provides 1. So do we really get meaningful data other than, you're up here, like the screener, right? I mean, it's not meant to be a full evaluation. The other point I want to make regarding that is that parents used to get the COGAT results in the mail with this letter, as you say, and it's incredibly difficult to understand because there are all these scores. And in a one brief sheet that doesn't do a nearly good enough job of explaining it. I used to have to explain it to a lot of people when I was involved in the gifted education community. How did the results come back from the NNAT, and how, our parents, receiving the COGAT letters seems to create stress around the community. I'm just wondering if that's likely to change.
So there's really no wait time for the NNAT scores to come back. We would actually print the student scores in the district and be able to send those out. I don't foresee the NNAT creating the same type of angst that the COGAT does. Here's what I worry about when we talk about screeners. Any screener out there, and you could name any one. I think people put a lot of stock in one screener, and in screeners where there are multiple domains where you get multiple scores, people tend to flock to where their child performed the highest and say, that's the reason my child should be either in the gifted program, or, this is why my child needs whatever it is that you're advocating what they need. With the NNAT and the way the data comes back, parents still get a pretty comprehensive picture of what their kids' performance can be. In addition to the letter, one of the things that I found to be helpful, because you're right, when you get those very clinically written letters, many parents, not that they're not bright, they're written in educational jargon, so they don't know what to do with them. And so one of the things around NNAT, we've talked about doing some things in our elementary buildings where we have different parent nights for different types of things. We do a Title I night. We do any number of curriculum type things. We can absolutely incorporate an informational session about NNAT so that parents can, in addition to the parent-friendly information that we'll provide for them, we can absolutely have those sessions where we actually talk parents through what that data actually means.
Thank you for that. I think that will be an improvement because I know from the gifted review and other things, we have always been talking about missing kids who really should get some gifted attention or could proceed quickly. So I assume you're going to start that. The letters will go out this spring. There will be no co-get testing this spring, and this will happen in the fall. So for rising second graders. Okay. If that's it, thank you for that one. And now we'll move on to our second or main presentation, since that one was just a little discussion.
That was just a little, I was going to say, I'm glad that wasn't a presentation. I'm glad it was just a discussion. Thank you. So last month we started to be part of the national conversation around adolescent sleepiness. And we're doing this for several reasons. Number one, purely qualitative, but if you're walking in our high school first thing in the morning, you see a lot of drowsy, kind of grumpy kids. And one of the things that we know that when kids, or really when anyone is incredibly tired, they're more likely to have issues with reflexes and everything from driving to taking a test. And so the Pennsylvania Senate put forth a resolution looking for a joint committee to do a study on adolescent sleepiness and school start times. Now, typically when we're talking about the government, even at the state level, when things get kicked over to the government, they die. But this issue keeps coming back up. And I anticipate in 9 or 12 months from now, there's going to be a recommendation or a set of recommendations about what districts should be doing to address adolescent sleepiness. And so at the last Education Committee meeting, we talked about some of the negative impacts of adolescent sleepiness. We talked about the Cleveland Sleep Questionnaire for adolescents. We've actually used that questionnaire with our students in grades 5 through 12. And tonight, I'm going to give you just a high-level overview of some of that data. This presentation, along with all of the survey data, will be available on the website tomorrow. And we're going to be coming back at a later Education Committee meeting, most likely in May, to talk even more about next steps. So, again, I said the presentation and full results will be on the district website. This is the first presentation, data presentation in a series. And keep in mind tonight, as we talk about the data, all of the data is self-reported by students. So we're going to review the highlights from the Adolescent Sleepiness Questionnaire. We're going to discuss just some of our preliminary conclusions, and then we'll discuss next steps for exploration of this topic. So as you see, there was a pretty even distribution among the grade levels 5th through 12 that took the survey. We had 1,970 responses. That's about 75% of the students that were eligible to take complete the questionnaire did. Greatest response rate was in 5th grade. And honestly, some of the 5th graders were so excited. I was in Maple Glen and I was at Fort Washington, and kids wanted to know, did I read their response? Did I know what comments were theirs? And if we changed the time, is it because of what they wrote? So I thought that was great. Lowest responses, proportionally came from our 12th graders. We didn't force anyone to take the questionnaire that didn't want to take the questionnaire because we didn't want to skew the results. So we're going to break this up into elementary data, middle school data, and then secondary data. Again, I know it's kind of hard to see on the monitor. This will be up on the website, and I'll probably tweet it out and put it on Facebook before I leave here tonight. So one of the questions, or two of the questions that were asked on the questionnaire were, what time do you go to bed and what time do you actually go to sleep? And so if you look along the side, we have before 9 p.m. and then it goes in half-hour increments. So you see, we have some elementary students that go to bed before 9 p.m. The majority of them or the largest percentage of them go to bed between 9 and 9:30. But if you look over at the second chart, we see a different distribution. So there is a gap between when kids go to bed and when they fall asleep. Now, some of that can just be a function of biology. Sometimes it takes a while for kids to shut their brains down, to really relax. Some kids are on social media. Some kids are reading. Some kids are doing any number of things. And the reason that we talk about looking at adolescent sleepiness from a whole child perspective is that school start times, moving school start times is just one strategy that could be employed to alleviate the problem of sleep. Very interesting that we have some students, again, self-reported, but going to bed in 5th grade as late as 10 o'clock, 10:30, 11, 11:30, and after midnight. I don't know about any of you, but with this time change, my bedtime's in about 20 minutes. So I can tell you that, are these kids reporting to try to be cool that they're going to bed a little bit later? Or do we really have kids going to bed that late? And do parents know that their kids are actually up that late? Waking up and feeling wide awake all day. These are two really interesting data points. What time do you wake up, and do you feel awake all day, or do you hit that, either you have that morning bump or that afternoon bump? So we see before 5 a.m. and then it's actually in increments from there, what time they wake up, with most of our 5th graders that completed the questionnaire waking up between 7 and 7:30. And then looking at how many of them, or what percentage of them, feel awake all day. Starting at the top, never, all the way down to almost every day, 5 days a week. As a former elementary teacher, I can tell you that when kids would come in to school and they woke up in that sweet spot, that 7 to 7:30 time frame, they were usually very ready to learn, they were very available to learn, and they were usually raring to go all day long. Kids that either got too much sleep or not enough sleep obviously didn't feel the same way during the day. So when we look at our 5th graders, we can draw some preliminary conclusion that 5th graders, generally speaking, are getting enough sleep. Some general themes. Students do not like to go to bed early. That was one of the comments that came up over and over again. My mom makes me go to bed early. My dad makes me to go to bed early. They don't like waking up early. I don't know any child, well, I do know some, but by and large, especially on school days, kids don't want to wake up early. Students do report being alert and awake during the day, but students do report that their schedules out of school impact sleep. So they talked about things like extracurriculars, or being on a travel sports team, or being part of any number of organizations. I think one of the students wrote, I'm really tired at 9 o'clock, but by the time I get home from soccer, something else, and do my homework, it's usually later than that when I go to bed. So these are results that we would generally expect to see at the elementary level. Now we go into middle school data, and I have to tell you the responses from the middle school kids, especially where they were able to give us some short answer data. The one just said, "Fix it, man." So I'm guessing he means we need to change school start time post haste. So going to bed and going to sleep, again, we start at before 9 o'clock and we go all the way until after 12:30, and then actually going to sleep. I was a little bit surprised by this data because a lot of kids are going to bed between 9:30 and 10, and a lot of them are falling asleep by that 10:30 hour. But if you look at the number of kids that would be falling asleep at 10:30 or later, many of our students are staying up late. And this is the time biologically when the need for the most amount of sleep starts to kick in. When you look at waking up, and feeling wide awake all day, the majority of kids, or most kids, said that they were waking up between 6 and 6:30 a.m. And the largest number of students said that they feel wide awake sometimes, 1 to 3 times during the week. When I visit Sandy Run, you don't necessarily see that morning drudgery where kids are coming in with their heads down. You see kids that are pretty awake, a little more lively than you would like to see in school hallways sometimes, but that's the nature of middle school. But one of the things you start to see by mid-morning and early afternoon, you start to see middle school kids start to crash. And then after they crash, they sort of rally, and by the end of the day, they're full of vigor again because they're going out to do any number of things, whether it's extracurriculars or sports. But very few of our students reported, only about 40 of our students at the middle school reported that they feel wide awake every day of the week. At the middle school level, students absolutely support the idea of later school start times. In fact, they support later school start times, but not changing dismissal. So that was something that came up. Like, we can come later, but we don't have to stay later either. We can just condense the day. Obviously, don't like waking up early. They do report being tired during the day. Many of them report that their schedules out of school impact sleep. This is where one of the things, whether it's through the health curriculum, whether it's through advisory, this is where that idea of managing time. Homework was brought up a lot. We're going to talk about homework in another setting and on another night, because homework actually is the least important priority after school, after all of the extracurricular sports and everything else that's going on. And the students at Sandy Run really do assert that their schedules outside of school do have a significant impact on their sleep schedule. And then we go to the high school. It's interesting when you go through the high school and you say hi to a student in the morning and you get the grunt like, ugh. And then you see them later in the day, they're like, oh, sorry, Dr. Yanni, I was tired this morning when I was talking with you. So you see, if we look at, again, following the same pattern, going to bed versus going to sleep, very few of our students at the high school are reporting that they're going to bed before 9 or even really before 10 o'clock. And going to sleep, if you look at when the majority of our students are going to sleep, you see it's between 11 and 11:30 and 11:30 and midnight. We're seeing still a lot of students going to sleep between midnight and 12:30. And what's really worrisome is that blue chart there of kids that are going to sleep after 12:30. Obviously, when we look at academic expectations, that drives some of this. But what also drives this are the extracurriculars and all of the things that kids are engaged in beyond the day. What also came out in some of the open-ended responses from our high school was the idea of social media. Snapchat being one of the most mentioned types of technology that are used when kids are winding down for the day. And we know that all the research out there says that you really can't wind down if you're still engaged with a screen. When I talk to kids at the high school, we were speaking about this a little bit earlier at the policy committee. When you talk to students at the high school and they're talking about a lot of homework and you drill down, some of them are taking 3 or 4 advanced placement classes. They're taking a very heavy schedule. So we're going to be talking about this idea of homework and what that really needs to look like in Upper Dublin as one of the strategies to combat adolescent sleepiness. Waking up versus feeling wide awake during the day. Between 6 and 6:30 a.m. seems to be the time when most of our students report waking up. An interesting distribution here. Again, the majority of our students saying that they feel wide awake 1 to 3 days during the week, or I'm sorry, during the week. But if you look down at that last bar, almost every day or 5 or more times per week, very few of our kids are reporting actually feeling wide awake, meaning fully rested and ready to take on the day. So what did the students report anecdotally? Feeling tired and sometimes having trouble falling asleep. Some of the kids actually said turning their brains off. Homework and extracurricular impact sleep a lot. I would say probably 2/3 or more of the open-ended responses from the high school specifically reported homework, extracurriculars, and sports. Students support later school start times as a strategy to combat this issue. And it's interesting, students realize, this came up over and over and over again in their open-ended responses. They realize that quality sleep is needed, but they admit that that's not the reality. So they know they should be going to bed earlier, but for all of the aforementioned reasons, that's not happening. So adolescent sleepiness is an issue in the district. Not a surprise. I would say it's an issue in every school district across the country. Education about sleep hygiene is needed for students and parents, guardians, and families. And what is sleep hygiene? What does that mean? It talks about, or sleep hygiene really encompasses what are the good conditions for sleep. So we're not having a screen up to our face right before we go to bed. What are the conditions that are best to sleep in? What are the optimal numbers of hours of quality sleep for students at different grade levels? And that's actually a piece of our health curriculum that's not there. And so that has to be a piece of the health curriculum that we embed. And students perceive that school start times are a cause for adolescent sleepiness, but they also acknowledge other factors. And so some of the kids actually said in the survey, if we change school start times, does that mean sports practices will happen in the morning? And so they're thinking a couple steps ahead. For example, thinking, well, if we push school back a half hour, are we going to fill that half hour with something else? But they do acknowledge that they're tired, but that and they know they're tired and they know how not to be tired, but it's just not the reality of their lives. So next steps. We plan to do some focus groups, most likely over lunch periods. When kids are eating, they're most talkative. So we will further explore their open-ended responses to get at the heart of what kids really want to tell us. I mentioned a little bit ago, earlier today at the policy meeting, we started a conversation about homework. What are our beliefs as a district around homework? How do we ensure that homework is meaningful and purposeful and not just an exercise in futility or not just an exercise to give kids an exercise outside of school? I think we really have to start, not just in Upper Dublin, but honestly across the state and across the nation. What are school expectations? What are extracurricular commitments? And what are home expectations? You know, especially as kids matriculate to the high school and they're looking at post-secondary education, they feel like that their plate has to be extremely full because that's what colleges and universities are looking at. I do think we have to strike some sort of balance in all of those expectations. We're going to be collaborating. We're going to have kids talk to students in other districts who have implemented changes. Unionville, Chadsford, and State College being two of them. Tredyffrin Easttown has made the commitment, as has Phoenixville, that they're going to be changing their start times next year. We have not made that determination yet. We have to look, that's one strategy. But what I think we want to do is have kids be able to talk to their peers in those settings where those things have changed so that kids can understand that better. And also working with student education, what sleep hygiene looks like. So we'll be having focus groups during the day with kids in the March and April timeframe. And then follow-up will occur at this meeting. We'll bring back the results of those focus groups. In the April timeframe, we're looking to have some parent focus groups on effects of sleepiness on adolescent health. There are many experts right here in our own backyard and in our region that have studied this issue, who have many resources to share with parents, guardians, and families. Really focusing on best practices for adolescent sleep and sleep hygiene, and then that focus group information will come back here as a discussion topic, presentation topic at our main meeting. So I think before I open it, for questions, one of the things that was really interesting, I had a conversation with 4 students at the high school, and it was 4 of them and me. We were talking before an event, and they were saying they never realized how little sleep they got until we asked them these questions. So when they said, like, yeah, I go to bed after 12:30, but I'm not really putting 2 and 2 together, that I'm going to bed or falling asleep after 12:30, and I'm getting up at 6, or I'm getting up before 6. And it's interesting. I saw one of those students today, or not today, Friday, and one of those students actually said, I'm making a conscious choice to try to get a little bit more sleep. So just like with everything else, when you bring this information to the conscious level, that's one strategy we're using to try to combat this. I anticipate that we'll have good student participation in our focus group, especially those 5th graders, because 5th graders, when you ask a 5th grader what their opinion is, there is no shortage of answers. So if I say I'm going to do a focus group, I expect to have a lot. And I have to tell you, one of the things that some of our middle school students were saying, well, we heard this on the news. Does that mean we're going to go to school later? And they were more hyped by just the idea of going to school later. They were like, Dr. Yanni, it'd be like having a delay every day. I'm like, yeah, but not really, because we would extend the day in the afternoon. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you for summarizing the data. As we talked about before, this is really an important question. I know, just hearing it this morning on the news, people were talking about, because this is the beginning of daylight savings when you spring forward, that there is always a slight, not huge, but a slight increase in automobile accidents the day, like today, the Monday that daylight savings starts. It's just another piece of data about the importance of sleep and how, when you don't get it, what happens. Comments or questions?
I'll just have one comment. So I think in terms of some of the goals or the next steps, there's high-hanging fruit, there's low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit seems to be sleep hygiene in terms of embedding that in the curriculum. What steps, I guess, or measures are we doing to perhaps address that low-hanging fruit before we kind of even move toward the high-hanging stuff?
Sure. So working with Kim Schuler, who still coordinates health and PE, we're already having those conversations about where it makes the most sense. There's a little bit of triage, and then once we triage it, where does it live well? So it seems that we need to do a little bit of sleep hygiene in every grade right now, and maybe in every grade for the next 2 or 3 years, until we're actually having kids internalize what that means. And then where does that live best? Does that live best in 5, 8, and 11? Does it live best in 5th grade and some other middle school grades? So that's already being worked into the health curriculum.
Jay, I do have a follow-up question. This one's going to actually be for Phil. So I wonder also some of the curriculum or the education we've been doing in regards to digital citizenship. And since Dr. Yanni, you had mentioned that some of it deals with screen time, is some of that being embedded also in terms of what we're teaching in regards to digital citizenship and how it relates to sleepiness?
Yeah, so the concept of digital citizenship really focuses around information literacy and responsibility for self and others. Really, this comes down to the nuanced multiple factors that Dr. Yanni outlined, an understanding of sleep hygiene by everybody involved, and really getting after the challenge of creating meaningful, purposeful homework. And there's a lot of great research on what effective homework looks like. And if you had looked at, this survey here, if we had done this when I was in school in the 80s, it would have looked very similar. So, the United States is atypical globally in what it does with homework and the volume of homework and the nature of that homework being mass practice, mass assign versus spaced assign. And so I think that's going to be a very healthy conversation for us here at Upper Dublin, is really looking at what are we asking kids to do outside of the school day? How is that an accelerator of what I can do with kids in a differentiated and personalized way in the classroom? And how am I using my class time so that I'm meeting all of those needs and optimizing that class time efficiently and not having 3, 4, 5, 6 hours of homework every night. Yeah.
I think there's also cultural expectations and societal expectations. One of the things, if you follow me on Twitter, sometimes you'll see that I'm tweeting at 1 o'clock in the morning because, you can't sleep, you roll over, you turn the TV on, you check some email. And I think, those behaviors are not just adult behaviors. Kids are doing that too. And one of the things is really a challenge of getting kids to unplug, especially when we talk about screen time. There's purposeful and non-purposeful time. The purposeful time, you're completing homework, that's good, but sort of the inane and, mindless, I know kids aren't on Facebook, but many of us are on Facebook, and you can get lost in Facebook and Twitter and any number of, electronic or digital media that aren't necessarily having a positive impact on your life.
I'll just add to that. So, especially in the middle school curriculum, when we look in and we have our digital citizenship curriculum there, we have kids specifically looking at issues around FOMO, right? This fear of missing out, and that importance of unplugging. Right, and also understanding that difference, right? Like, just like all food is not created equal, a calorie is not a calorie, right? Screen time is not created equal either, right? And homework, whether it's paper or digital, is not created equal, right? So it's about thinking about the quality. There's definitive research on, I need to disconnect not only from screens an hour before I try to sleep, but I need to disconnect from minds-on work. Like, if I'm working really hard and then I shut off the light, I'm not going to shut off my brain, right? So I need to somehow make time to disconnect from the busyness of life and read a book, hang out with my family, whatever that is, to wind down. And we've all know that here because we had little kids at some point, right? Like, we know what it is to get this little thing to wind down to go to sleep, right? What are those routines that we do to cognitively unplug and virtually unplug?
As you know, I have a lot of ideas on this and thoughts about this. But first of all, I think this is a real good opportunity for families to go and have conversations on this topic, because I think what happens here at school is one thing, but what happens at home and is a huge part of this. The other thing I want to highlight is that just starting time is not necessarily the focus of this, and I think you said that there's many different ways of doing this. You could spread out school years and all sorts of other options. And then I think another piece is we have a whole bunch of athletes in this district who actually, may even start their days even earlier. I think of some sports who start by 5:30. These kids oftentimes develop an enormous discipline in partitioning their days. They may be in bed by 9 o'clock. Doesn't mean that they're not tired, because they're physically very tired, but they have a balance between their academics and physical activity and other things. And then I think it's that managing of time and that focus and that setting of priorities, that is a big part of this as well. And I think it's great that we're looking at this, and I'm looking forward to more coming out of it. Thanks.
I just want to address one comment to a little bit of the topic of athletes like swimmers and stuff. So I wasn't there in person, but one of the most renowned sleep experts in the country, Dr. Judith Owens, spoke at Radnor recently, and you can actually see her talk on YouTube. So one of the questions that she was asked by a parent had to do with things like swimming and hockey, where just because of the sport, access to the facility can't be during the main part of the day, and it has to be, sometimes it's really early in the morning, sometimes it's late at night. And she said, you're not going to, by changing the start time, you will fix a lot of things about sleep, but you're not going to address every single problem. So her answer was, it's really better to try to fix things most of the time or much of the time for many people, even though you are still going to have some issues. So I just wanted to add that in.
Wait till we have the homework conversations.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Ticia said, maybe you, and with the later start times, increase the school year by a month, and this way the afternoon sports or evening sports wouldn't really be affected. And then my other question is I'm probably going to get in trouble for this, but is there any data out there that supports the fact that teachers and administrators, their job performance goes up with the later start time?
So there's no data per se on that right now, nor is there any concrete data on student academic performance. There are some large-scale changes that are happening. Seattle Public Schools being one large system that they have several research companies that are going to be looking at data over a course of a couple years. But there is no data right now around job performance or student performance. This is all of the research out there, and all the data right now is solely focusing on adolescent sleepiness and the effects of that.
So just to add a little.
Are you asking me if I'm more effective after 10 a.m.? Yes, the superintendent's starting hours are 10 to 2 with an hour lunch.
So 2 comments with regard to that. I don't know. I mean, there are hints in the data of increased performance, but by and large, the school districts that change their start time do not do it because they want to see improved academic performance. They want to see the things that other people have seen, which is that have to do with health outcomes, reductions in sports injuries, reductions in tardiness, more engagement during class. I mean, there are health issues as opposed to better grades. And the other comment about that, I mean, I don't have necessarily an opinion that teachers don't do better if they get more sleep. But in terms of the biology of sleep, adolescents, because of the way melatonin is released in the body and some of the other factors that determine adolescents have a shift in their biological need to go to sleep and mostly cannot fall asleep before 11. Adults, on the other hand, do have a greater ability to vary their schedule. So if it is an adult who has to get up at 5 a.m. every day, they may not, but they biologically don't have the impediment of not being able to shift their schedule.
Okay. We actually have an opportunity, I think a really big opportunity, with an event that we do every year, and it's actually happening tomorrow night. So for those here and those watching, the college fair is absolutely fantastic in this district. Having been a college rep for many years, one of the things that I don't think our parents and students do enough is talk to colleges and universities about what the expectations really are for admission. And, this might be a great conversation to have with Donna Ward and the guidance team about preparing the kinds of questions to ask schools. Every school is extremely different. I have a friend who is an executive with a company called Slate. They run the software that helps many schools do admissions, and it's programmed individually for every school. You need to know what your school is looking for. And there's this huge misconception, I feel like, in Upper Dublin that we just have to do more. We have to do more. We have to be more well-rounded. And so, if you can get to the college fair tomorrow night, I think the other misconception is that we only take, juniors to college fairs. I think if you start having this conversation as freshmen, then you're planning your activities and your thoughts around, some real concrete information. So I know I take my freshman and sophomore friends too.
Along those lines, Mrs. Franczyk, when we talk about taking 7th graders and 8th graders to Eastern Center for the Arts for them to see what that looks like with college and career readiness standards, we really do need to start having those conversations about college expectations, about what colleges look at, not to stress kids out, but almost to give some sense of comfort at the freshman level. Because you're right, many kids think, and many parents and families think, I have to do everything that's available to me to get into XYZ school. And many times it's not about the quantity of things that you're doing, but the types of things that you're doing and how involved in those types of things that you are. The other thing, just as an aside, this year when we post our matriculation list, we're not only going to be posting the list of colleges that our kids are going to, but the schools that kids are accepted to. Because I think what happens in a district like Upper Dublin, where people assume that everyone is really wealthy, and you don't see the number of maybe the Ivies that we want to see, they're forgetting that some of the other top tier schools are throwing a lot of money at kids in terms of scholarships and whatnot. And so I think it's important to provide that whole picture, not about adolescent sleepiness, but about college. But I think exposing our freshmen to what colleges are actually looking at does set a very different tone moving forward through the high school experience, because I do worry that sometimes kids don't enjoy their high school experience because they're trying to do so much for the next station in life. And I think that's a little bit of low-hanging fruit, to use Dr. Kim's word. That's some low-hanging fruit that we can address as well.
Yeah, one short thing. As you're looking at focus groups, are you also including teachers and counselors? Because I think that's another group will have good observations. And the other piece is that I would be remiss in reminding you that there is an EAC report on this very topic, and that would be a good reference for people as well.
Yeah, there is an EAC report. We've looked at it. We'll continue to keep that at the forefront. And yes, we're looking at some professional development time where we can do a focus group with staff. Absolutely.
I may have mentioned this before, but I do have to say, I appreciate the EAC reports. I was on the EAC for a while, and I know a lot of effort goes into them. But there are two things about the EAC report that on sleep and school start times. One is they only looked for studies that looked at the effect of changing start times on academic performance, not on any health or wellness measures. And the second thing is that a lot of the studies, the more academic studies, are really behind paywalls that, unless you have a university access to the databases, are really hard for a community-based research group to get at. So, there's some issues with relying on a report like that. That's, even though there are some good suggestions in it. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments on this topic? We'll have a time there's a couple other items of business which will probably be very short, and then we'll have time for community input. Okay? Thank you. So there are two other items. We already talked about elementary gifted screening. So we have student activities and we have conferences. So rather than going through and reading them all, I'm just going to open it up for questions about, first, the field trips. Does anybody have any questions about the field trips? So there is a PMEA All-State Festival, the choir, that is one field trip. One is Model UN trip. There is the SGA Steering Committee retreat in May. There is a National Academic Championship for the middle school, and there's an International Thespian Conference. Are there any comments on or questions about any of these? If not, we will move those forward. Is there going to be anything that needs to be on the agenda for the change of tests, or was that just a discussion item? Okay. Okay, the other item is conferences. And we'll go the same way unless you have some specific things to explain.
I just want to address the issue of conferences. And as we start to plan for next year, I think one of the things that has happened in the district for the last several years, we've sent a lot of people to a lot of conferences. And one of the things that I think in the parameters that I'm developing for next year is you'll see fewer folks going to conferences, but we'll be doing some turnkey training back in the district. The district has also done a lot of one-day sort of hits, and I want to make sure that as we're expending money for conferences in the future, that we're aligned to some more clear focus areas that are furthering the district initiatives that are at hand. Tonight, I think there's about $6,000 worth of conferences up there. I feel very confident in looking at the conferences over the last 12 to 18 months that we can significantly reduce that and still have the same measurable impact in the district, but be able to route money back to classrooms more effectively.
Any questions about the specific conferences on the agenda?
Yeah, can I ask a quick question? I'm seeing two music teachers going to what looks like the same conference. One is staying longer than the other, or longer than the other one, but the cost is less. Is that because of transportation?
Yes, it's because of the transportation.
If there are no other questions, we'll move that forward also. Okay, so at this point, we've taken care of all of our business, and we are ready for community input.
Dr. Ludwig, can I just mention one thing before we go to community input?
Yes.
I want to update everyone. As you know, our director of curriculum, Ava Morrison, retired, and she has moved on to be the head of school at the Martin Luther School. And so when she retired, we took the opportunity to retool that position, and we called it a chief academic officer. And I want to just explain very briefly the intent behind doing that. One of the things that I think is critically important is that we onboard someone that focuses solely on curriculum and instruction. And whether, sometimes in education we give positions titles like assistant superintendent or assistant to the superintendent or what have you. And I wanted to make it very clear that the person that we're bringing on, their sole responsibility is the education of our kids. And last week we had the good honor of meeting 14 candidates in a first round. We're bringing 6 candidates forward tomorrow evening to meet with our principals, and then there'll be a subsequent round. And one of the things that I may be asking the board's indulgence is to have a special meeting before our April Education Committee meeting to approve our new chief academic officer. I think it would be an appropriate setting for that person to be introduced at an education committee meeting, because that person will be one of the liaisons to the committee.
Thank you. I look forward to meeting some of the candidates, and especially the finalists. Now we're up to community input. So if anyone in the community would like to speak, questions or comments, now's the time. You have to come up to the podium and use the microphone because we record this. Say your name, what part of the community you're from, and then try to keep your comments within 4 minutes.
My name's Lisa Lemire, and I am in, I don't know, the Fort Washington part of the school district. With regards to the sleepiness discussion, it was interesting listening to you because have only read in the press about sleepiness, and I honestly was not understanding that it was more on the health side of metrics than on the performance side of metrics that we might be focusing. So I just wanted to say that as a way, and actually both of us sitting there next to each other had the same question. So it occurred to me that other parents also might be thinking that there's a wide range of success metrics that we're hoping for coming out of this, and that aligning up front on what the measures of success are would be very helpful in getting all the parents on board quickly to what we're hoping to achieve. That's it. Thank you.
Audrey Dudley. I have a student at Sandy Run. In full disclosure, I'm a high school teacher at another district, so I completely understand and empathize the sort of pushing the start time. I think most parents and even people in schools don't fully appreciate that it's more than just a performance-driven reason to change the start time. So I think that probably you'll have to lead with because in full disclosure, I'm also an athletic coach and a high school teacher. And so I start my day really early. Most of you are probably still sleeping. And then I end really early, but during tennis season, I run out of daylight. So we've got to get our matches in before the sun goes down and the warm weather ends. So it's a lot of factors that are really pressing on moving that time if it does move. And I think for the students also really going out hard, letting them know why the start time, if it would move. That it's looking at the whole child because it impacts them so much, their sleep deprivation. And I did a study today in my classroom because of the delay and how many students were completely out of it. It was really, I did it in all of my classes and it really had an impact. The other thing, and this is purely commentary, is rolling out to the parents their ability to impact their child's sleep, particularly with unplugging and also with winding down. I think most parents, only from having meetings with parents, they don't realize the significance that the devices have in their children's lives. Even though they pay the bill and see how many hours are being used, I think they really don't appreciate it. I mean, I do every day because the phones are a really big distraction. And I think it's a huge issue that if it should be led with first. And I think that could impact sleep deprivation of the children on a real basis right away. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, okay.
Points well taken. And one of the things is as we bring the focus group information back. Last month we talked about all the health effects, so tonight was more of that data presentation. But you're absolutely right, leading with what the CDC is now calling a health epidemic for adolescents, I think really does set the stage for parents, guardians, families to understand that this issue is much larger than just school start times. It's looking at an entire way of life.
So just piggybacking on that, I mean, I think, as Dr. Yanni said, that, I mean, that in bringing this topic to the community and to parents, there are really, I think, two or maybe many more aspects of it. One is parent education, just like there is student education. What are the components of sleep, and why is it a problem specifically with adolescents? And we did talk about that a little bit last time. So we need to do some of that. The second part is really to hear, whether it's parents, teachers, students, members of the community, businesses that people work in, every aspect of the community, what their concerns are. That's kind of a secondary. I mean, it's not secondary in terms of less important. It's kind of the second aspect of having this discussion. But it is necessary before you would even come to any proposals to change the start time.
Yeah, and to add to that, it's probably also not something that we can do in isolation. It probably is combined with all other districts in the area.
I mean, it may or may not. I mean, I think some of these things are easier when you combine with other districts or make a general change across a county or a sports league or a career and technical school. But we do have examples. I mean, Unionville Chadsport is one in our area who made the change by themselves, and they have found it really didn't interfere. Now, I mean, they had every district has its own special issues, and you know how they do busing, how far apart the schools are located, all kinds of things that can go into it. Because what works in terms of the logistics of making something like this work, one school district may have to do something different than another school district. So, I mean, I think as we go forward with this, all those things have to be taken into consideration. Any closing comments before we adjourn? Yes.
So I just want to make note, and actually it's what Dr. Yanni had referenced in regards to our first preliminary conversation in regards to the homework policy will be actually next Monday at a special policy meeting held here at the high school. It'll be at 2:30, Monday, March 18th.
Thank you. And my last comment is I really appreciate Dr. Yanni's approach to this as a whole child issue, where we look at extracurriculars, homework policies, sleep hygiene, as well as the school start times. So with that, we're adjourned. Our next meeting will be, when will it be? April 8th. Monday night, same place, same time.
Did you get the email, by the way? Yes. Okay, very good.
I did respond, yeah.